My name's Hubwood, and because I love benchmarking with Gerald, I wanted to find out if The Witcher 3 is playable on Full HD with less than minimum system requirements. So, since for every PC that I've built or tested lately, The Witcher 3 was on the benchmarking list, I wanted to find out if I could build a PC just below the system requirements of The Witcher 3 and still have an acceptable experience. To be honest, it kinda became my own personal "but can it run" crisis. The official minimum requirements by CD Projekt Red state that you'll need at least the following: an i5 2500K, a NVIDIA GTX 660, 6GB of RAM and 40GB of free disk space. But do we really need this to play the game in a satisfying way? Well, of course, the term satisfying is pretty stretchable, but I've decided to aim for at least 30 FPS on Full HD, with any kind of settings. But of course I assumed it was going to be kind of lowish. So, well, I chose to use the following hardware. An Intel Core i5-750, the first i5 ever built, which was released in September 2009, which was 6 years before The Witcher 3 was released. By the way, if you would have used a CPU from 1997 for games from 2003, they probably wouldn't even have opened themselves. A GTX 650 Ti, which is quite a bit slower than its bigger brother, the GTX 660, and only 4GB of RAM. To ensure the 4GB wouldn't be eaten by the OS, I've decided to go with Windows 7 instead of Windows 10. The hard disk is a very simple 320GB HDD and a very basic 350W Office PC PSU without a dedicated 6-pin cable, so I had to use a Molex adapter, oh my god. The FSP 350 60HHN. What a great name! Spoiler! The PSU was strong enough to support the system even with CPU and GPU heavily overclocked. By the way, if you would like to know how to overclock your GPU, it's kind of going to be over here, I think, just somewhere up there. Like, the PC itself without the GPU cost me $60 on eBay and the GPU cost me $40 on a local used parts platform. I also wanted to overclock the CPU pretty high, so I threw in a €12 cooler, the Arctic Alpine 11 Plus, which allows at least for some basic overclocking. And in case you didn't know, the i5-750 is an awesome CPU in terms of overclocking. But to stay fair, I've also tested the whole system without any overclocking at all. Luckily, the PC had a pretty decent Gigabyte P55M UD2 mainboard, which allowed me to overclock the i5-750 from 2.8 to a stable 3.8 GHz, raising the Cinebench R15 score from 331 to 448. The temps still were barely what I'd call acceptable, even with a cheap €12 CPU cooler from Arctic. The Gigabyte Windforce version of the GTX 650 Ti wasn't as forgiving in terms of overclocking, but at least allowed me to raise the core clock by 60 and the memory by, well, 500 MHz. I've tested the game in 1080p aka Full HD as well as in 900p. Just to have a look at what these settings look like, I recorded a short clip of all of them to share that with you. Just enjoy. By the way, in my opinion, the game's atmosphere is strong enough to even enjoy it on 720p and lowest settings, but that's just an opinion and you're of course entitled to think otherwise. So, before I reveal the 1080p benchmarks, we'll first have a look at the performance in 900p. And on 900p and lowest possible settings, the system delivered very playable frame rates of 46 FPS for the stock system and 52 FPS for the overclocked system. Even the 1% low was very acceptable for such an old CPU and it basically felt fluid all the time. For 900p and medium settings, I was able to get 33 FPS for the system at stock settings and 39 FPS for the overclocked system. I'd still consider the game very enjoyable in both cases, but the overclocked system definitely had quite the advantage. The 1% low dropped to 17 FPS, but to be honest, The Witcher 3 has always had problems with frame drops, especially in the big cities like Novigrad and Beauclair. Now comes the moment of truth, 1080p aka Full HD. On low settings I was actually able to achieve enjoyable frame rates at stock settings as well as of course with the overclocked system. 37 and 42 FPS. That's more than most console games deliver these days. Okay, admit it, we're on low settings, but the game turns out to be definitely enjoyable on a PC which is below the minimum system requirements. And last but not least, I dare to fire up the game at 1080p and medium settings. The game begins to really look very good now, the graphics now definitely need much more power. On the stock system I saw only 26 FPS on average with a 1% low of only 10 FPS. And as this is still playable for some people, I'd consider it, not very enjoyable. But once more the overclocked system was able to deliver around 20% more performance and therefore a still playable 32 FPS on average with a 1% low of 15. Now let me be clear and honest. With those settings and the system in general, you would experience frame drops and some stuttering once in a while. Especially on 1080p and medium settings, the game is definitely drawing every single drop of performance from this low budget PC. Once more, expect the bigger cities to cause severe frame drops. My suggestion would be to play it at 1080p and a mix of low and medium, or just low, and as an alternative play it on 900p and medium settings. So I don't know about you, but in my opinion, the mission was a success. Let me know if you think otherwise. If you liked the video, you know what to do. If you disliked it, let me know why. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you want more shenanigans like what you just saw. Thank you, bye bye, and see you next time.